You know how she is, Dad. It was 2:15 a.m. when the police shattered the silence of my bedroom, and I played the part perfectly. The confused, innocent old man. From behind their silk curtains, you know how she is, Dad. My wealthy neighbors watched, with bated breath, as officers slapped the steel on my wrists and hauled me away. My wife stood in the driveway. Phone held high to record every second, a faint, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. He'd laughed a bad, but when we reached the precinct, the chief detective flipped open my classified file, read only 2 lines, and suddenly snapped to attention. He turned to his officers, his voice trembling as he ordered them to unlock my cuffs immediately. He looked at me with genuine alarm, asking the one question, one that changed everything. My name is Rick Stanton. I'm 70 years old, and I am still reeling from the betrayal of the people I trusted most. As a retired forensic auditor for the U.S. Treasuries, I thought I understood the darker side of human nature, but I never expected to find it at my own dinner table. Last month, my family threw a lavish banquet, allegedly to celebrate my legacy. See, to celebrate my legacy. Amidst the expensive wine and toasts, my wife leaned in close and whispered with a cold smile, "You know, Rick, you've been lucky for a long time. It's a shame it has to end." I just sipped my coffee and smiled back. That night, I logged into my systems, deactivated every shared credit account, and began setting the trap. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to stand up for yourself against family who underestimated your worth, please hit that like and subscribe button. Living in Virginia is synonymous with privilege, but inside our sprawling colonial mansion, a deep emotional coldness had taken root. You know how she is, Dad. That house with its manicured lawn and heated pool had become a fortress of greed and hidden motives that I could no longer ignore. That night, the heavy oak doors of my estate didn't just open. They were forced inward with a deafening crash that shook the hardwood floors. Blinding flashlights cut through the darkness of my bedroom before I could even sit up. You know how she is, Dad. Angry voices roared, ordering me to the floor. Before my brain could even register the staged chaos, you know how she is, Dad. I was dragged off the mattress and pressed against the cold wall while steel cuffs bit into my wrists. I am 70 years old. My joints ache on damp nights. You know how she is, and sudden movements send jolts of pain through my spine. Yet, they handled me as if I were a dangerous fugitive trying to flee the country. I didn't resist. I didn't shout or demand a lawyer. I kept my breathing steady and my face completely blank as they marched me out of my own home. My bare feet stumbled against the expensive flooring I'd installed 3 years ago just to make my wife happy. The cool night air hit me as they dragged me down the driveway. The red and blue police lights painted the quiet, high-end neighborhood in chaotic flashes. I could see the silhouettes of neighbors pulling back their curtains. I could see to witness my downfall. And there, under the strobing lights, was the ultimate betrayal. And under the strobing lights was the custom Aston Martin. The glare bounced off the polished hood parked near the garage. You know how she is, Dad. It was a car I had bought for my son, Derek, just a month ago to celebrate his promotion. Standing by that expensive machine was Victoria, the woman I had been married to for 12 years. She was dressed in full designer wear, completely composed, holding her phone with perfectly manicured hands. The camera was aimed squarely at my face. She didn't scream for them to stop. She didn't cry. Instead, her mouth twitched into that same faint, victorious smirk. Derek stood right next to her, my own flesh and blood. The boy I'd carried on my shoulders, the son I'd sent to the best universities in the country. He stood there with his arms crossed, staring at the concrete, refusing to meet my eyes. You know how she is, Dad. In that moment, looking at the two people I had spent my life providing for and protecting, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated takedown. The ride to the station was a blur of deafening silent and streetlights. My mind raced, piecing together the timeline and the silent collusion of those I lived with. When we arrived, they tossed me into a small, sterile interrogation room. The walls were a sickening pale green, and a humming fluorescent light cast an unnatural glare. The metal chair dug into my back, and the wrists throbbed light, but I didn't ask for my phone call. So, I simply waited, letting the heavy, suffocating silence grow. After what felt like an eternity, the heavy door clicked open. A man in a rumpled gray suit walked in, dropped a thick manila folder on the table with a loud thud, and sat down. You know how she is, Dad. He introduced himself as Detective Harris. His eyes were weary, filled with the self-righteous judgment of a man who thought he'd caught a wealthy white-collar criminal. You know how she is, Dad. He leaned in and laid out the devastating charges. He told me, decade you'd. You know how she is, Dad. According to the documents in his folder, I had systematically embezzled $8 million from the Veterans Charity Fund managed by my wife. He listed dates, wire transfer numbers, and offshore accounts in the Caribbean. He claimed they had found my digital signature on every illegal transaction, linked to the specific IP address of the desktop in my private study. It was a clean, perfectly packaged piece of evidence, a masterpiece of framing designed to put a retired real estate investor away forever. He'd laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. He slid a printout of a wire transfer across the table and mockingly asked if I had anything to say before he handed me over to federal authorities. I looked down at the paper, scanned the falsified numbers, and then looked up to meet his smug gaze. I told him he needed to look much deeper into my background, the full, unfiltered federal file, not just the surface-level portfolio my treacherous family thought was my life. Detective Harris frowned, clearly annoyed by my lack of panic. He aggressively pulled out his laptop, logged into the secure federal database, you know how she had, and entered my name and social security number. As the page loaded, I watched the blue reflection flicker in his eyes. He scrolled quickly at first. Then, he stopped. He leaned in closer to the screen, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. I watched the color drain from his face until he looked like he'd seen a ghost standing right behind me. His jaw literally dropped. He read the words again, tracing with his finger to be sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. Suddenly, he stood up so fast, his chair screeched against the linoleum. He looked at the two uniformed officers by the door and shouted, his voice cracking with sudden, unmistakable panic. "Take the cuffs off. Now!" The officers hesitated. You know how she is, Dad, looking at him in utter confusion. Off she is." "Take them off now," he roared. They rushed forward, fumbling with their keys, and finally released my wrists. I rubbed my sore joints and took a deep, satisfying breath of the stale station air. Harris sat back down, staring at me with a completely different expression. The arrogance was gone, replaced by pure, terrified bewilderment. He swallowed hard. "Mister, you know how she is, Dad." "Stanton," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Your file shows you are a retired senior forensic auditor for the U.S. Treasury. It says you personally designed the automated anti-money laundering software the entire federal government uses today. He pointed a shaking finger at the fake evidence on the table. Why would a man who literally wrote the textbook on international financial tracking be framed for such a sloppy, amateur offshore tracking? I flexed my fingers, reached offshore fraud case. I flexed my fingers, reached into my suit pocket, and calmly pulled out my personal phone. I bypassed the security protocols and pulled up the real-time encrypted server feed I'd set up weeks ago. How she is, Dad? I locked eyes with him, letting a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I have been waiting for this exact night for 3 months, Detective. Now, turn your laptop toward me. You know how she is, Dad? Let me show you exactly who is going to federal prison before the sun comes up. To understand the weight of what happened next, you have to go back to the exact moment this nightmare began. You know how she is, Dad? 3 months ago, on a quiet Tuesday night, the air was unusually cold. I went to bed early, fighting a tension headache. Around 2 a.m., I woke up with a dry throat. You know how she is, Dad. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, feeling that familiar ache in my knees. I grabbed my thick wool robe and walked into the dark, silent hallway, intending to get a glass of water. The house was deathly quiet. You know how she is. As I passed, caught a thin line of pale light, my eyes caught a thin line of leaking from under the door of my private study. That room was my absolute sanctuary. It was where I managed my investments and kept classified records from my time at the Treasury. No one was allowed in without my express permission. Not my son, and certainly not Victoria. I stopped breathing for a second. The security system for that room should have been fully engaged. I walked silently across the thick Persian rug. I placed my hand on the cold brass knob, turned slowly to a few inches, and pushed the door open a few inches. The sight inside made my heart sink. The glowing monitor of my secure terminal cast a harsh blue light across the dark room. Sitting in my high-back leather chair, typing furiously, was my 38-year-old son, Derek. Standing right behind him, eyes glued to the screen, was my wife, Victoria. The image alone was deeply unsettling. In the 12 years Victoria and I had been married, Derek had always maintained a polite disdain for her. They barely spoke at family dinners. Tuesday, yet here they were, in the middle of the night, huddled together and whispering frantically like seasoned conspirators. I pushed a spurstasis. Derek. The heavy door opened. It creaked loudly, and both of them jerked their heads up. Derek jumped, his hands flying off the keyboard. Victoria gasped, hand over her heart, in genuine shock. I walked into the room, keeping my posture relaxed and my voice calm, and asked what they were doing with my secure plocked and my voice calm, and asked what they were doing with my secure terminal in the middle of the night. For a split second, pure panic flashed in Victoria's eyes, but she was a master of social manipulation. In the blink of an eye, the panic vanished, replaced by a smooth, manufactured smile. You know how she is, Dad. She walked over and wrapped her arms around my neck, planting a kiss on my cheek. We wanted to surprise you, darling, she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. You know how she is, Dad. You caught us. We were setting up a private charity foundation in your name as a gift for your 70th birthday next month. You know how she is, Dad. We wanted to have the framework ready to show you at the party. Derek jumped in immediately, desperately trying to steady his nerves. He picked up a stack of printed paper, holding up an official-looking document. I was just helping Victoria with the complex IRS tax-exempt codes. Dad, you know how complicated these federal filings are. I was just verifying the bank routing numbers for the initial endowment. We really didn't want to wake you. You should go back to sleep. Go back to sleep. It was a brilliant, persuasive lie, a carefully constructed narrative that preyed directly on the pride and vulnerability of an aging father. You know how she is, Dad. A normal 70-year-old man would have been moved to tears. He would have hugged his devoted wife, praised his hard-working son, and gone back to bed with a warm, satisfied heart. But I was not a normal 70-year-old man. I had spent 30 of my years in cold federal interrogation rooms, systematically breaking down some of the most some of the sophisticated financial predators on Wall Street. I knew he'd be the Megid-like. I knew exactly what the anatomy of a lie reactions the human body has when a thief realizes the walls are closing in. When Victoria smiled at me, I noticed the pitch of her voice was exactly half an octave higher than her natural tone. Her pupils were fully dilated, the result of a sudden surge of survival adrenaline. I looked past her at my son. Derek held the tax forms with a feigned casualness, but his knuckles were bone white from gripping the paper too tightly. The overhead reading light revealed a fine, unmistakable sheen of cold sweat on his trembling palms. He was breathing entirely from his upper chest, short and shallow, struggling to take in enough oxygen. Somehow she is, Dad. These were the exact physiological signs I used to look for when watching a corrupt hedge fund manager desperately trying to hide millions of dollars. They were terrified. And they were absolutely not starting a veterans charity. I needed them to feel completely safe. I needed them to believe their clever lie had worked perfectly. I needed to become the clueless old man they thought I was. So, I let a warm, grateful smile bloom across my tired face. I reached out and gently squeezed Victoria's arm. I looked at Derek with bright, proud eyes. You know how she is, Dad. That is truly thoughtful, I said, my voice filled with staged emotion. I am honestly moved beyond words. I'm sorry for interrupting your hard work. You're right. I should go back to sleep. I'll let you both finish your wonderful surprise. Victoria visibly exhaled. Her tense Dad, her shoulders dropping an inch as the unbearable tension left her body. Derek forced a smile and whispered, "Good night." I turned slowly and began to walk out of the study, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. But just before the door clicked completely into the frame, my eyes made one last sweep of the polished surface of my mahogany desk. My encrypted flash drive, the physical hardware token containing the master digital signatures for all my global financial accounts, was always placed in the top right corner. It was always perfectly aligned with the straight edge of my dark leather mouse pad. Always. You know how she is, Dad. As I looked through the narrowing gap of the closing door, the harsh blue light of the monitor illuminated that specific corner of the desk. You know how she is, Dad. The encrypted USB drive was no longer parallel to the mouse pad. It had moved exactly 2 millimeters to the left, and a tiny green light on its metal side was blinking rapidly. You know how she is, Dad, indicating an active, massive data transfer. You know how she is, Dad. When that horrifying truth finally hit me, my blood ran cold. I clicked the heavy door shut, walked silently down the hallway back to the dark bedroom. You know how she is, Dad, and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. They were absolutely not preparing a birthday charity for me. My own wife and my only son had just successfully stolen the digital keys to my life. After that chilling discovery, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed for the remaining hours, staring at the ceiling, carefully slowing my heart rate. The anger burning in my chest was blinding, a hot, violent urge to confront them immediately. I wanted to storm into the master bedroom, shake Victoria awake, and force the absolute truth out of her. I wanted to draft Feinlich. Stat was out it apart. I wanted to drive to Derek's house and tear his office apart. You know how she is, Dad. But 30 years of dismantling complex financial fraud had taught me an undeniable lesson. You know how she is, confronting criminals before mapping their entire network only teaches them how to build higher walls. If I played my hand now, they would simply encrypt the stolen data, destroy the hardware, and pivot to a new strategy. Before tightening the noose, I needed to understand the full scope of their betrayal. So, when the morning sun finally pierced the curtains, I put on my most convincing mask. I walked down the grand mahogany staircase, feeling that familiar ache in my knees, playing the part of the tired, slow-moving retiree to perfection. I greeted Victoria in the kitchen with a warm smile and accepted the black coffee she handed me with complete calm. She was radiant, her movements light and relaxed, fully convinced her midnight lie had worked perfectly. I drank my coffee and read the morning paper, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to present itself. It didn't take long. Later that afternoon, a low, aggressive roar echoed through our quiet, tree-lined street. It was the distinct, deep growl of a high-performance engine, shattering the suburban peace and drawing my attention to the front bay window. A brand new, flawless slate-gray Porsche 911 pulled slowly into my wide concrete driveway. The morning sun gleamed off its pristine ceramic coating. The driver's door popped open, and my daughter-in-law, Monica, stepped out. Laughed at Dad. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses, an expensive silk shirt, and carrying a handbag that easily exceeded a standard monthly mortgage payment. Know how she is, Dad. I walked out to the front porch and plastered a pleasant, welcoming expression on my face as she strode up the steps. She looked incredibly smug. You know how she is, running her manicured fingers affectionately over the roof of the shimmering sports car. It was a beautiful machine. I did a quick calculation in my head of the interior trim and custom wheels. The sticker price was right around $140,000. It was an incredibly lavish, blatant display of wealth. Derek arrived 10 minutes later in his own car, parking directly behind his wife's new toy. Steps. He walked up the steps, looking slightly nervous, his eyes darting quickly to the Porsche before settling on me. We all sat on the patio overlooking the heated pool. You know how she is, drinking iced tea in the warm afternoon air. I played the role of the proud patriarch, asking simple, open-ended questions to get them talking. I turned my attention to my son, my voice filled with gentle, supportive concern. I asked how his investment firm was performing this quarter. I expected a boastful answer, something to match the stunning new car parked in my driveway. Instead, Derek let out a heavy sigh, rubbed the back of his neck, and put on a perfectly rehearsed look of deep exhaustion. He told me the market was brutal right now. You know how she is, Dad. He complained about massive losses over the last 3 months, claiming that several major client portfolios he managed had unexpectedly plummeted. He spun a very convincing story about long hours, extreme corporate pressure, and the company's constantly tightening budget. He looked me straight in the eye and said they were barely scraping by this quarter, waiting for the economic tide to turn. You know how she is, Dad. Monica sat beside him, nodding with the utmost seriousness, sipping her tea, and playing the part of the perfectly supportive wife. They were an excellent team. But as I watched them perform this tragic little play, the alarm bells in my head were deafening. My forensic intuition, honed over 30 years of tracking hidden assets for the federal government, locked onto one glaring contradiction. Yoon laughed about it. An investment firm manager struggling with massive, devastating losses would never authorize Alice's wife to go out and drop $140,000 on a brand new luxury sports car, especially not a car without temporary dealer plates, which indicated this was a full-price, immediate cash purchase, not a standard lease agreement. The math didn't add up. Their story had completely fallen apart. Hase, you know how she is, Dad? They stayed for another hour, Asa chatting with Victoria about neighborhood gossip as if everything were perfectly as if everything were perfectly normal. I smiled, nodded, and offered a few sympathetic tips on how to weather a tough financial market. I watched them drive off, the powerful roar of that Porsche echoing down the street with a mocking tone. The second their taillights vanished around the corner, I walked back inside, bypassing the compromised computer in my study. I headed straight for the basement storage, a dusty, forgotten room where the estate's main fiber optic line entered the house. Hidden behind a stack of old cardboard boxes and winter coats was a secondary high encryption server I'd installed years ago. You know how she is, Dad. It was a fail-safe, a ghost node that wouldn't appear on any standard network scan. Victoria and Derek had no idea it existed. I pulled a small, you know how she is, Dad, ruggedized laptop from a locked steel safe, connected it with a physical Ethernet cable to the hidden switch, and booted it up. My fingers flew across the keyboard. You know how she is, Dad, inputting command lines with muscle memory that had never faded. I bypassed the standard user interface, diving straight into the raw back-end routing logs of my home network. I isolated the traffic from the exact window when I'd caught them in my study, 2 a.m. I ran a deep packet inspection, searching for any trace of the IRS tax codes Derek claimed to be studying. I searched for the digital application for the charity foundation Victoria had described so sweetly. Nothing. No federal tax forms, no nonprofit registration searches, no innocent birthday surprise. Instead, what I found made me clench my jaw with a cold, focused fury. The logs showed a massive, violent brute force attack. It was a sophisticated digital breach designed to silently bypass my external firewall and establish a secure, untraceable tunnel. I traced the tunnel's outbound destination. The data packets weren't routed to the IRS. They jumped through 3 different, terminating at a high-security private VPNs in the Cayman Islands. They were linking my stolen digital signature directly to an offshore holding company, a notorious tax haven designed to hide untraceable wealth. They were moving money, massive amounts of it. But the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle wasn't where the data was going. It was where it was coming from. You know how she is. I ran a reverse trace on the local network, and the origin of the attack was inside my own house. These malicious commands didn't come from Derek's phone or an external device. I stared at the blinking green cursor, feeling a heavy, sickening pressure in the pit of my stomach. You know how she is, Dad. The specific MAC address running the illegal offshore script belonged to one piece of hardware. You know how she is, Dad. It was registered directly to Victoria's personal silver MacBook, the laptop she used every day to browse recipes and email friends. You know how she is, Dad. The laptop that sat on our kitchen island upstairs. As I processed the reality of that digital footprint, my head spun. My wife wasn't just a passive participant in my son's desperate financial crime. She was the one actively hosting the secure connection. She was the one who had hacked into my network alongside him. Sitting in the dim basement, surrounded by the humming of the server, I asked myself the question that made my blood run cold. Why would my wife secretly build an offshore financial fortress with my son? I couldn't confront them yet. Confronting criminals without having the trap laid is just inviting them to scrub their tracks, and burn the evidence to the ground. The next morning, I limped into the pristine kitchen and leaned island. I forced a painful, realistic grimace, kneading my lower back and sneezing. My lower back and knee to perform my daily routine. Busy. Victoria looked up from her tablet, her face shifting instantly into a mask of concerned duty. I told her the damp autumn weather had made my joints seize up. I said I couldn't endure another month of this creeping agony, and that my specialist strongly recommended a 2-week intensive physical therapy retreat in Boca Raton. I made sure to sound exhausted, like a broken, fragile old man desperate for a quiet escape from his daily suffering. I told her the retreat strictly prohibited phones and laptops to encourage a total digital detox. I made it clear that I'd be leaving all my electronics, my bamboos, including my highly encrypted work laptop, right here in the house. The look of triumph she shot toward the hallway, where I knew Derek was standing, was all the confirmation I needed. They practically helped me pack my leather travel I needed. Helped me pack my leather travel bag 2 days. After I kissed my treacherous wife goodbye and boarded the airport shuttle. After driving exactly 3 blocks, I had the confused driver pull over and let me out. You know how she is? I didn't go to the airport, and I certainly didn't go to Florida. Instead, I walked into an unremarkable, weathered brick apartment building. I had quietly rented a ground floor unit earlier that week under the name of an untraceable shell company. You know how she is, Dad. The apartment was empty except for a folding plastic table, a very uncomfortable chair. You know how she is, and thousands of dollars worth of advanced tactical server equipment I'd procured through confidential channels. I pulled the heavy, you know how she is, Dad, dusty blackout curtains shut and started assembling my Reels workspace. I contacted a secure private liaison, a former Treasury cybersecurity expert who was a genius. I'd saved his life years, Dad. I'd saved his life years ago during the intense days of tracking cartels through Miami shell companies, and he owed me a favor. I didn't tell him about the humiliating family drama. I just told him I needed a blind, untraceable routing mirror to safely override my personal home network. Over the next 48 hours, fueled by bitter black coffee and a cold, enduring rage, I wrote complex, self-executing code. I wouldn't just block them from my financial servers. I was going to open the vault doors wide for them and invite them right into the trap. In the world of federal forensic auditing, we call it a honeypot. It's a deceptive, perfect mirror of a digital environment designed to look exactly like the real target. The goal is to silently entrap ambitious attackers, letting them foolishly believe they've broken into the main vault. I meticulously crafted a flawless digital replica of my main financial holding accounts, ensuring the visual layout was indistinguishable from the actual database. You know how she is, Dad. I intentionally placed my secure digital signature protocols where they could easily find them. You know how she is, Dad. And I subtly lowered the security on my internal firewall, just enough to make them feel successful without looking suspicious. But I completely rigged the international transfer protocols. When they used my stolen signature to authorize the transfer to their Cayman Islands account, the money would appear to Island account, the money would appear to move, but before the final, irrevocable overseer's jump, it would secretly loop through a highly monitored IRS tracking wire. This hidden automatic cycle would legally flag the entire MAT transaction as a level 1 federal threat and permanently brand the receiving offshore account with an indelible digital watermark. They really thought they could quietly spirit millions into the dark. In reality, they were painting a giant, glowing federal target on their own backs. You know how she is, Dad. Once the trap was perfectly set, I logged into the hidden, high-definition micro cameras I'd installed in the crown molding of my study the day before I left. I sat alone in the dark apartment, my weary eyes locked on the glowing monitor. 3 days passed, painful, silent days, and nothing happened. Then, on a rainy Friday night, a silent motion sensor alert flared on my main screen. The live feed of the study suddenly brightened. Derek walked in, his movements driven by the frantic, eager energy of a hungry man finally seeing his meal. Victoria followed closely behind, quickly locking the heavy oak door. They sat at my mahogany desk, rushing to open the laptop I'd so thoughtfully left behind. You know how she is, Dad. I watched my son's fingers fly across the glowing keyboard. Through my secondary tracking monitor, I watched the local network traffic spike. They took the bait perfectly. They easily found the mirrored gateway. You know how she is, Dad. Confidently bypassed the simulated firewall and couldn't wait to steal my secure digital signature. I watched the green progress bar on the screen fill up as they initiated a massive, irrevocable international wire transfer. $8 million. It was almost all of my liquid assets. The transaction finished. The screen flashed a bright, solid green approved notification. Derek collapsed back into my leather chair with a pure, unadulterated sigh of relief. Victoria actually clapped her hands of their success, a silent, joyful celebration of their success. She walked purposefully, Tsunamsgold's dad. She walked purposefully to the mahogany cart in the corner of my study, pulled out an expensive vintage champagne I'd been saving for our anniversary, and popped the cork. She poured 2 crystal flutes and handed one to my son. They tapped their glasses together in a joyful toast to their incredible windfall and my absolute devastating windfall and my absolute devastating bankruptcy. I watched them celebrate, feeling a toxic mix of deep grief and a boiling, uncontrollable fury churning in my chest. Then the locked door of the study clicked open. My daughter-in-law, Monica, walked in, confidently. She wore an incredibly expensive designer coat and scanned the brightly lit study with sharp, calculating eyes. She walked straight to Victoria, plucked the crystal champagne glass from her hand, and took a long sip. She swallowed, smooth, empty eyes directly toward Derek. She asked a brutal question that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. Are you 100% sure the sun's ice? Are you 100% sure the old man is going to take the fall for this? I really don't want to end up in federal prison. Because your father was too smart to be prison because your father was too smart to be manipulated. I stared at the monitor. My breath catching in my throat. She stood as Monica's cruel question echoed through the study. She stood there drinking the vintage champagne I'd bought for my anniversary, looking at my son with a cold, calculating gaze. You know how she is, Dad. I turned up the volume on the receiver until the crystal clear audio from the hidden microphone filled the dark apartment. I wanted to hear every syllable. You know how she is, Dad. I needed to hear exactly why my own flesh and blood would choose to destroy my life. Derek laughed. It was a harsh, you know how she is, Dad. dismissive sound that echoed through the hidden speakers and sent a deep chill down my spine. He leaned back in my leather chair, swirling his glass, completely comfortable in the space he was currently violating. "You're being paranoid, Monica," he said smoothly. "The old man is clueless. He thinks we're throwing him a surprise party. The digital signature protocol is foolproof. The digital signature protocol is foolproof. We aren't just moving 8 million into a random account. We're wiring it directly. We're wiring it direct to an illegal offshore gambling syndicate in Macau, and it's being done entirely under his verified identity. You know how she is, Dad, using his dedicated network and his private encryption keys." A wave of physical nausea washed over me. They weren't just stealing my liquid assets to fund their lifestyle. You know how she is, Dad. They were actively constructing a perfect federal trap. As a former forensic auditor, I knew exactly what moving funds to a sanctioned gambling syndicate meant. This would immediately trigger federal anti-terrorism and anti-racketeering protocols. It was a guaranteed federal indictment. Victoria smiled, tracing the rim of her crystal glass with a manicured finger. "The Treasury will flag this transfer by tomorrow morning," she murmured, sounding excited by the prospect. "Once federal agents trace the digital footprint back to this specific router and verify the authorized signature, they'll raid this house. You know how she is, Dad. They'll arrest him before he knows what hit him. He won't be able to defend himself because the digital evidence is absolutely irrefutable." My chest tightened with a suffocating pressure. I had spent 30 years of my life building a perfect reputation, serving my country, and tracking the very same types of criminals my family was now mimicking. Now, my wife was gleefully counting down the moments until tactical teams kicked down my front door. But Derek wasn't finished. He leaned in, elbows resting on my mahogany desk, and delivered the killing blow that shattered the last bit of fatherly hope in my heart. "This is the perfect exit strategy," Derek explained, his voice devoid of any human empathy. "The old man has lived too long anyway. Once he's locked up, the state will seize the dirty assets linked to the gambling syndicate. They'll freeze his accounts immediately, but we've already laundered most of his remaining estate through the fake charity foundation. We get a few million, and he gets a small federal cell for the rest of his miserable life." I closed my eyes and let the sheer cruelty of his words wash over me. This was my son, the boy I taught to ride a bike, the young man I proudly watched graduate from university. He was discussing my death in a federal prison, as casually as if he were discussing a successful corporate merger. He didn't care about the humiliation, fear, or physical torment a 70-year-old man would face in prison. You know how she is, Dad. He only cared about liquidating my life's work and removing me from the equation entirely. I watched the screen, observing the three of them celebrating their clever deception. Victoria leaned over and kissed Derek's cheek, congratulating him on his brilliant strategy. You know how she is, Dad. Monica raised her glass, proposing a toast to their coming freedom and vast wealth. They were a unified of pure malice. They were a unified front of pure malice, perfectly at peace with the horrible fate they'd assigned me. The anger that had been simmering in my gut hardened into something cold and indestructible. I was no longer a grieving father or a betrayed husband. I was a trained investigator dealing with hostile financial predators. Suddenly, the celebratory mood in the study was interrupted by a sharp, piercing ringtone. Victoria quickly placed her champagne glass on the table and pulled a cheap prepaid burner phone from the pocket of her designer jacket. I recognized the significance of the device instantly. A woman with thousands of dollars in designer bags and the latest smartphone wouldn't carry a plastic burner phone unless she was communicating with someone deeply rooted in the criminal underworld. She looked at the screen, her eyes widening slightly, and immediately held a finger to her lips, signaling Derek and Monica to be perfectly quiet. Two's-eat, deet, deet. Frost gads. They froze, their triumphant smiles fading into tense anticipation. Victoria tapped the screen to answer and deliberately hit the speakerphone, letting the audio broadcast clearly into my study and straight into my hidden microphone. "Is it done?" A raspy voice came through the small speaker. I stopped breathing. "You know how she is, Dad." I leaned toward the monitor, my heart hammering against my ribs. Even though the sound was heavily distorted by the cheap speaker, the cadence, the low raspy cawing tone, and the distinct, drawn-out pronunciation tune of the consonants were absolutely unforgettable. It was a voice I hadn't heard years. It was of Long who should have I hadn't heard in 5 years, the voice belonging to a man who should have been permanently banished from the United States of America. Yes, Victoria replied, her tone shifting instantly from arrogant confidence to submissive awe. The transfer just cleared the final security gateway. $8 million is sitting securely in the holding account. The digital trace leads directly to his personal network, exactly as you instructed. We executed the plan perfectly. Excellent, the raspy voice replied, accompanied by the faint, clear click of a lighter and a slow exhale of smoke. The federal tripwires should trigger soon. Make sure you are completely clear of the blast zone when the authorities come to take him. I will begin moving our funds through the secondary cleaning accounts immediately. You did well, Victoria. A sickening, twisted knot formed in my stomach. The pieces of the puzzle shifted, revealing a new and terrifying picture. This was never just a greedy family plotting to steal an inheritance. This was a strike professionally orchestrated and executed by an external threat. And I knew exactly who was pulling the strings on the other end of the line. And I knew exactly who was pulling the strings on the other end of the line. The voice coming through my dark apartment belonged to a man named Lillo. He was Monica's brother, a cold-blooded, extremely dangerous felon. 5 years ago, I had personally assisted the federal government in dismantling his operations and ensuring he was deported. I had destroyed his criminal empire, and now, you know how she is, Dad. He was using my own wife and son to execute his ultimate revenge. They thought they were the masterminds of this operation, but they were utter fools. I sat completely rigid in the dim apartment, staring at the glowing monitor, the chilling reality of what that raspy voice represented echoing in my mind. Leo wasn't just a common thief. He was a top-tier predator in the global financial underworld. Leo Depenu. You know how she is. Years ago, I had handed the federal authorities the exact routing maps they needed to dismantle his vast network of offshore shell companies. I watched the marshals lead him away in heavy chains. I watched the judge sign his deportation order. I thought the nightmare he'd brought to the financial sector was over forever. But I had severely underestimated the depth and patience of his vengeance. He hadn't just disappeared into the shadows of international exile. He had spent half a decade meticulously cultivating a devastating revenge strategy, planting his poison right into the foundation of my own family. Monica wasn't just a greedy daughter-in-law pushing my son into corporate theft. She was an active undercover plant for a deported cartel operative. You know how she is, Dad. She was the vital bridge connecting my vulnerable, arrogant son and my treacherous wife to a sophisticated international criminal syndicate. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, initiating a top-secret audio tracking protocol I'd developed in my final years at the Treasury. You know how she is, Dad. The burner phone Victoria was using operated on a highly encrypted frequency, but Leo was arrogant. He was broadcasting via a static satellite relay, thinking geographic distance could mask his digital footprint. Within 3 minutes, my proprietary software sliced pinpoint through his baseline security layers, pinpointing pinpointude, and longitude coordinates, latitude, the exact source of the transmission. Latitude and longitude coordinates filled my screen in bold white text. He was broadcasting Braxton from a heavily fortified private beachfront villa in Nassau, but Bahamas. The pieces of this horrific mystery snapped together with sickening clarity. This was never a simple family coup. This was a hostile takeover organized by a criminal syndicate operating right in my living room. Victoria, how she is, Dad. Victoria and Derek truly thought they were independently stealing my wealth to fund their lifestyle. They thought they were using Leo to safely launder the stolen funds, but they were nothing more than incredibly expendable, idiotic pawns in a much grander, more malicious execution. Once the funds officially cleared the final international gateway, Leo would instantly cut all digital ties, drain the offshore accounts, you know how she is, Dad, and leave my wife and son completely exposed to the relentless wrath of the federal government. You know how she is, Dad. He was using their unrivaled greed to orchestrate both my physical destruction and their eventual legal ruin. I needed to act with surgical precision. You know how she is, Dad. If I triggered a massive federal alert right now, local police would storm the house. Leo would vanish into the international storm with my $8 million, Naz. You know how she is, Dad. And my reputation would still be completely destroyed in the ensuing media spectacle. I needed a ghost. I needed someone who understood the intricate, you know how she is, Dad, invisible mechanisms of international banking law better than anyone alive. I reached for my encrypted satellite phone and dialed a private unlisted number I hadn't called in nearly 3 years. After 2 rings, a sharp, incredibly professional voice answered. It was Jonathan Bradley. Jonathan was my former legal counsel, a brilliant, Dad, cold-blooded attorney specializing in offshore recovery and clandestine international corporate litigation. I skipped the standard pleasantries and laid out the exact parameters of the crisis. You know how she is, Dad. I told him my master signature had been compromised in my home and an $8 million malicious transfer was currently routing through international wire protocols to a Cayman Islands holding company controlled by a deported felon. Jonathan listens, sinking into a chilling, absolute silence. When I stated the scope of the syndicate's infiltration, his response was swift and razor-sharp. He didn't waste a second offering empty sympathy about my family. He'd laughed about it. He simply demanded the specific routing numbers and the exact registration information for the destination. You know how she is, Dad. I read the alphanumeric codes directly from the active tracking logs on my monitor. Jonathan explained the tactical strategy with military precision. We couldn't simply cancel this massive transaction. If the funds suddenly stopped moving, Leo would instantly realize the secure connection was compromised, and he would order Victoria and Derek to destroy all the physical hardware in the house. You know how she is, Dad. We needed to make the criminal syndicate believe they had achieved an absolute victory. Jonathan initiated a highly classified banking maneuver. He possessed the rare legal authority to contact the Cayman Islands Central Clearinghouse and play specific sleeving, silencing account. The transfer would key in an invisible frozen lock on the specific receiving account. The transfer would appear completely successful on Leo's monitoring software. The holding company dashboard would actively display the full $8 million balance, glowing in solid green text. But the moment Leo tried to transfer even a single dollar out of that account, the funds would mathematically evaporate into a secure, untouchable federal escrow vault. It was secure core, untouchable federal escrow vault. It was the ultimate financial ghost trap. We would let them celebrate their stolen wealth, completely unaware that what they held in their hands was a digital mirage. Jonathan assured me. The silent freeze would be fully active within the next 20 minutes. He told me to stay completely clear of the main network and wait for his confirmation signal. I sat in the dark, quiet apartment, listening to the soft hum of the tactical server's cooling fans. The adrenaline that had been surging through my veins slowly began to recede, leaving behind only the cold, hollow ache of a profound betrayal. I watched the live video feed of the study. Victoria, Derek, and Monica were currently pouring a second round of expensive vintage champagne, laughing carelessly and discussing which specific S group is a local evening news, sate sipsipally luxury-laced that night. My own wife's was happily announced my federal arrest later that night. My own wife was happily toasting my absolute destruction to my absolute destruction. Exactly 35 minutes after I ended my call with Jonathan, a secure, encrypted email notification suddenly flashed on my main monitor. It was a priority message directly from his private offshore server. The subject line was completely blank. I quickly opened the encrypted digital file. I quickly opened banking confirmation file, expecting a standard banking confirmation verifying that the silent freezes on the implemented. However, the attachment was a high-definition surveillance photo taken by one of Jonathan's elite corporate agents currently stationed in the Caribbean. I stared at the clear digital image. Feeling all the air violently leave my lungs. The photo showed a sun-drenched terrace outside a highly exclusive, you know how she is, Dad, extremely expensive beachfront cafe in Nassau. Leo was sitting at a private corner table, looking as ruthless as ever, and sitting directly across from him, leaning intimately over the white table, was my loving wife, Victoria. Her hand was resting affectionately on his. They were sharing a passionate, undeniable kiss. Last month, Victoria packed her desire luggage and explicitly told me she was going on a quiet, 2-week health spa retreat in the Colorado mountains to clear her head. You know how she is, Dad. I stared at the surveillance photo on the encrypted monitor, feeling the last remaining fragments of my 12-year marriage turn to ash. You know how she is, Dad. The absolute gravity of this deception hit me like a physical blow. Victoria wasn't just a greedy wife wanting to cash in with her ambitious stepson. She was deeply entangled in a romantic affair with a cold-blooded international criminal. The pieces of this horrific mystery finally fit together. You know how she is, Dad, forming a picture of depravity that defied every human boundary. Leo wasn't just using my family. He was sleeping with my wife. Monica was his own sister, acting as the key bridge in my house. And my son, Derek, the boy I raised and protected, was nothing more than an incredibly stupid fool. He was the perfect oblivious pawn. You know how she is, Dad. They were using his extreme greed and desperate desire for wealth to facilitate the theft. The final plan was now painfully obvious. They would use Derek to hack my terminal, wire the $8 million to Leo, and perfectly frame me for a federal crime. Once the authorities dragged me away in handcuffs, Victoria and Leo would vanish with the cash, leaving Derek alone to face the remaining domestic consequences. You know how she is, Dad. My own flesh and blood was actively digging my grave. Completely unaware that his beloved wife and treacherous stepmother had already dug a second grave right next to it specifically for him. How she is, Dad. I tore my gaze away from the cursed photo and looked back at the live video feed coming from my hidden study camera. The celebratory mood in the study began to change. Derek was pacing restlessly on the Persian rug, rubbing his temples. He mumbled something about needing to clear his head, claiming the adrenaline from bypassing the federal firewall had left him extremely anxious. He told Victoria and Monica he was going to take the new Porsche for a long drive along the coastal highway to calm his nerves, before finalizing the last batch of domestic transfer documents. Victoria walked over to him, placing her hands gently on his chest, playing the role of the supportive, conspiring heroine to perfection. She know how she is, Dad. She praised his brilliant computer skills, assuring him the hardest part was officially over. I watched my son nod, completely intoxicated by her toxic validation. You grabbed his coat. He grabbed his coat and walked out of the study. A moment later, the sound of the front door slamming shut echoed through the audio feed, followed by the distant, aggressive roar of the sports car's engine starting in the driveway. You know how she is, Dad. The absolute second the engine sound vanished at the end of the street, the entire dynamic inside my private study changed completely. Victoria and Monica stood in the center of the room, listening carefully until they were absolutely certain Derek was gone. Then that warm, domestic smile melted off their faces like cheap wax. Victoria walked back to my mahogany desk and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sent a new wave of cold fury rushing into my veins. I can't believe how incredibly easy it was to manipulate that pathetic boy, she sneered, her voice dripping with absolute venom. I spent 3 months slowly feeding his massive ego, planting the seeds that he was more entitled to your father's wealth than anyone else. He was practically begging me to help him steal the money. Monica laughed wickedly, pouring herself another glass of my vintage champagne. You know how she is, Dad. My brother said Derek was the perfect idiot for this operation, she replied smoothly. He was just smart enough to bypass the basic security routers, but too arrogant to realize we're setting him up to take the fall for the secondary black book crimes. Leo wants the old man to rot in a maximum free security federal Tuesday because he did his empire 5 years ago, startup or 5 years ago on. But he wants Derek destroyed simply because he's a weak, pathetic husband. Victoria nodded coldly in agreement, sitting back in my leather chair. She waved a manicured hand dismissively, brushing away 12 years of marriage without a second thought. For over a decade, I've played the loving, beautiful wife to that boring, paranoid retired auditor, she sneered. I've earned every single penny of that $8 million. You know how she is, Dad? Tomorrow morning, when federal agents raid this house and drag Rick out in chains, Leo and I will be on a private charter to Nasru de Tasakil. Derek can stay behind and explain to federal prosecutors why his digital fingerprints are all over the secondary network servers. He'll be indicted within a week. He'd laughed about it. Sitting in that dark apartment, my hands clenched into tight fists as I listened to the pure, unadulterated malice radiating from my own home. They weren't just stealing my money, they were weaponizing my entire legacy. Victoria leaned forward, waking up my computer screen. Seed. She dragged her mouse across the digital desktop, opening a series of highly classified folders I'd stored on the local drive. Through my cloned monitor feed, I watched her pull up perfectly forged IRS tax-exempt forms and fraudulent charity donation certificates. They had prepared everything in advance. "You know how she is, Dad?" Monica leaned over Victoria's shoulder, pointing to the bottom of the digital documents. Victoria clicked a specific file containing the highly encrypted digital signature they had stolen from my secure flash drive just an hour earlier. With a few quick, practiced movements, she systematically dragged and dropped my verified signature onto 14 separate illegal documents. You know how she is, Dad. She was actively fabricating a massive paper trail, officially linking my identity to a sprawling network of phantom holding companies and offshore gambling syndicates. Every click of her mouse was another nail in my coffin. I watched my wife effectively sign away my life, skillfully building an undeniable mountain of catastrophic evidence that would guarantee I'd never walk out of a federal prison. They were incredibly thorough, leaving carefully crafted breadcrumbs designed to lead federal investigators straight to my doorstep. You know how she is, Dad. The moment Victoria saved the final forged document to my local drive, a sharp electronic chime cut through the quiet study. You know how she is, Dad. The sound came directly from the cheap burner phone resting next to my keyboard. Because I was actively monitoring the entire local network through the hidden proxy, you know how she is, Dad. My tactical server instantly intercepted and cloned the incoming cellular packets. You know how she is, Dad. The short text message appeared in bright white letters on my secondary monitor a fraction of a second before Victoria even picked up the physical device. It was an urgent, you know how she is, highly encrypted text from Leo in the Bahamas. I stared at the glowing text on my screen, feeling the collision course accelerate. I realized the true depth of their betrayal and the terrible danger I faced. The message read, "You know how she is, Dad. Federal agents are sniffing around the holding account faster than we expected. The silent quarantine protocol was triggered. We have to go all the way tonight before he figures it out. Call the anonymous federal tip line. Report the old man now." The trap had finally snapped shut. I stared at the intercepted text on my monitor, the cold reality of Leo's command sinking in. On the live video feed, Victoria didn't hesitate. She read the text from her deported lover, locked eyes with my son and daughter-in-law, and gave a firm nod. Derek swallowed hard, his face pale with fear, but he did nothing to stop her. Monica stepped back, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Victoria picked up the cheap plastic phone, took a deep breath to steady her pulse, and dialed the anonymous federal law enforcement tip line. What followed was a masterclass in sociopathic acting. The moment the federal operator answered, Victoria's confident posture crumbled. Her voice began to tremble violently. You know how she is, Dad, accompanied by manufactured terror and perfectly timed, breathless sobs. She told the operator she was a terrified wife who had accidentally discovered something horrific on her husband's computer late last night. She claimed she had found highly illegal offshore bank transfers, massive sums routed to international gambling syndicates, and irrefutable proof of a sprawling money laundering network. Laundering network. You know how she is, Dad. She cried, realistically into the receiver, her shoulders shaking as she begged the agents to hurry, claiming she feared for her life and the lives of her stepson and his wife. You know how she is. She pointed the finger squarely at me, Richard Stanton, providing my exact home address, my personal network routing numbers. You know how she is, Dad. and the precise physical location of the secure flash drive on my mahogany desk. You know how she is, Dad. She perfectly painted the picture of a brave, desperate whistleblower risking everything. I sat alone in the dim light of my rented apartment. You know how she is, Dad, listening to my own wife orchestrate my complete destruction. I didn't feel sadness, nor did I feel panic. Instead, a deep, icy calm washed over me. You know how she is, Dad. The web of lies was fully spun, and now it was time to let them set fire to themselves. I turned away from the video feed and focused entirely on my tactical servers, and focused entirely Q's servers. My hands moved across the keyboard with the steady precision of a man who had spent 30 years tracking top-tier predators. I established a secure, highly encrypted tunnel directly into the Treasury Department's classified back-end servers. I bypassed standard reporting channels, utilizing deep access priority protocols reserved only for elite forensic auditors. I systematically packaged the irrefutable proof of their crimes. I capturing their clear footages, Breen study camera, capturing the raw footage, camera, capturing their clear faces, verbal confessions, and treasonous toasts. I gathered the comprehensive logs from my honeypot trap, detailing every keystroke Derek made while trying to transfer the $8 million. I compiled the intercepted cellular metadata, linking Victoria directly to Leo in the Bahamas, along with the surveillance photos from Jonathan. With one final, decisive keystroke, I executed the master upload. A green status bar appeared on my monitor, filling rapidly as the massive data packet traveled through secure lines crimes straight to the desk of the federal chief of financial crimes. The evidence was permanently logged in the federal database, completely out of my hands and impossible to erase. He laughed about it. I watched the confirmation flash on the screen, indicating the federal system had successfully received the file. My work here was officially done. I shut down. You know how she is, Dad. I shut down the tactile servers, cleared the temporary local drives with a localized magnetic sweep to ensure no digital residue remained in the apartment. You know how she is, Dad, and stood up from the uncomfortable folding chair. My knee joints popped in the quiet room, a sharp reminder that I was 70 years old. I walked over to the small closet where my travel bag sat, moving with unhurried grace. I pulled out a freshly pressed, custom deep navy suit, a crisp white dress shirt, and a conservative silk tie. You know how she is, Dad. If I was going to be arrested in my own home tonight, I would face the authorities looking like a respected federal auditor. Not a broken, desperate, old man caught in his pajamas. I dressed meticulously, adjusting my cuffs and ensuring my tie was perfectly straight. I fastened my classic silver watch to my wrist. You know how she is, Dad, feeling the comforting weight of the heavy metal band. He'd laughed about it. Packing the rest of my personal items into a leather overnight bag, I left the apartment as empty and anonymous as I had found it. I stepped out into the cool, damp night air. The streets were empty, draped in the quiet stillness of the suburban night. I unlocked my sedan and slipped behind the wheel. The drive back to my estate in McLean, Virginia, took exactly 7 minutes. He'd laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. It was the most peaceful drive of my life. The streetlights flickered overhead in a rhythmic pattern, casting long shadows across the dashboard. I felt no fear about the impending raid. I knew the tactical teams were already gearing up, donning heavy vests and acting on the frantic, fabricated tip my wife had provided. You know how she is. Dad, they thought they were coming to arrest a sophisticated money launderer. They had no idea they were stepping into a carefully constructed theater where I had already written the final scene. I pulled out in the quiet neighborhood, turning off my headlights to avoid alerting Victoria or Derek. I bypassed the main driveway, parking quietly on a dark street 2 blocks away. I grabbed my leather bag, walked across the damp grass, slipped through the side gate, and entered my dark home through the garage access door. The house was silent. Moving like a ghost through the shadows, I stepped into the spacious living room. The moonlight poured through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the expensive imported furniture Victoria had selected to showcase our lifestyle. Victoria had selected to showcase our decanter on the side finger, poured a small finger of expensive, aged bourbon, small amber of liquid shimmer in the bourbon, and watched the amber liquid shimmer in the dim light. So walked high-back armchair. I walked to my favorite high-back leather armchair, positioned perfectly to face the front bay windows, and sat down. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the smooth bourbon, letting the warmth bloom in my chest. Crossing my legs, I rested my hands on the armrests and simply waited in the suffocating silence. I reflected on the 30 years I'd given to my country, the massive sacrifice I'd made to provide for my treacherous family, and the profound, beautiful irony of what was about to unfold. They thought they had buried me under a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence. They thought they had buried me under a mountain of irrefutable digital boss made them untouchable. Dad. They were about to find out what happens when you try to corner a man who spent his entire life building cages for wolves. The red and blue police lights suddenly flashed through the living room windows, and the heavy front door exploded inward. The timeline of this nightmare rushed forward, catching up to the present moment where I sat in that sickeningly pale green interrogation room, opposite Detective Harris. You know how she is, Dad. The harsh, fluorescent lights hummed above us, casting long, sharp shadows across the metal table. My phone sat flat, playing the undeniable truth. The detective's arrogant, cynical judgment had completely evaporated. He sat frozen in his cheap folding chair, staring blankly at the glowing screen of my device. I had just walked him through the entire digital architecture of my honeypot. He had watched the cloned video stream of his suspects celebrating my impending doom. He had seen the intercepted messages from a deported cartel boss. You, Dad? He had witnessed the exact moment Victoria dialed the anonymous federal tip line, weaponizing the local police department. The silence in the small room was absolute. You know how she is, Dad, broken only by the veteran detective's rapid, shallow breathing. Harris slowly raised his hands to rub his face, as if trying to physically erase the sheer scale of the corruption he had just witnessed. When he finally lowered his hands, his eyes burned with a fierce, insulted rage. He realized his entire precinct had been played for absolute fools. They had been manipulated into acting as the blunt instrument of an organized crime syndicate, sent to arrest an innocent, highly decorated former federal auditor while the real criminals drank vintage champagne in my living room. The veins in his neck throbbed. He reached down to his heavy utility belt, unclipped his police radio, and hovered his thumb aggressively. He locked eyes with me, his jaw set in a hard, angry line. I'm calling the tactical response team right now, Harris growled. His voice shaking with response team right now, Harris growled. His groon boy, his voice shaking with barely suppressed fury. You know how she is, Dad. I'm sending a heavily armed SWAT unit back to your estate in McLean. We're kicking down your front door for the second time tonight. You know how she is, Dad. I'm going to drag your cheating wife down that driveway in handcuffs, and I'm throwing your son into the deepest holding cell this precinct has to offer. You know how she is, Dad. They aren't walking away from using my officers to facilitate a massive offshore laundering operation. I didn't hesitate. I slammed my open palm flat against the cold metal interrogation table. The sudden, violent crack echoed like a gunshot in the sterile room, bouncing sharply off the concrete walls. The two uniformed officers guarding the door jumped, their hands instinctively reaching for their sidearms. Harris flinched. You know how she is, Dad, his thumb freezing just above the radio transmission button. Stop, I commanded, my voice projecting the unyielding authority of a man who had commanded federal task forces for 3 decades. Do not arrest them yet. Put the radio down, detective. Harris stared at me in disbelief, his hand lowered slowly to the table, but he didn't let go of the radio. Are you out of your mind, Mr. Stanton? He demanded. You know how she is, Dad, his voice rising. As we speak, your family is actively transferring $8 million to a known deported international criminal. We have them recorded on tape. If we raid the house right now, we can catch them with the active digital hardware. We can end this nightmare tonight. If you send your tactical teams into my home tonight, you will completely destroy 3 months of meticulous federal planning. I replied, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Arresting Victoria and Derek right now is the worst tactical maneuver you could possibly make. You know how she is. If your local officers kick down that door and put cuffs on their wrists, the district attorney can, at best, charge them with wire fraud and local conspiracy. They'll hire They'll high-priced defense attorneys, drag the proceedings out with endless appeals. And Hughes likely serve less than 5 years in a minimum security white-collar facility. You know how she is, Dad. I don't want them to get a slap on the wrist. I want them completely destroyed. I want them to feel the absolute crushing weight of the federal government dismantling their entire lives. Harris leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling to digest my cold, calculating logic. But the money, he argued, pointing frantically at my phone screen. If we don't stop them, Riz Dad, if we don't stop them right now, that $8 million will successfully clear the final offshore gateway. You'll lose your entire gateway. You'll lose your entire life savings. I shook my head slowly, crossing my hands over the metal table. You aren't thinking like a federal auditor, detective. You're thinking like a local cop responding to a robbery. I need you to understand the intricate mechanisms of federal asset forfeiture laws. If you arrest them now, the transaction will be officially ruled as interrupted mid-transit. Because the funds are moving through a simulated honeypot, you know how she is, Dad. And because multiple international jurisdictions are suddenly involved, that $8 million will immediately enter a permanent legal limbo. It will be frozen by international banking courts. You know how she is, Dad. It could take me corporate a decade of grueling corporate litigation just to prove the funds were stolen and successfully repatriate my own money. Furthermore, if Leo senses any local police's intervention, you know how she is, he will instantly burn his servers in the Bahamas and vanish into the shadows. I can establish a concrete jurisdictional claim. We cannot spook him. I leaned in closer to Harris, maintaining intense, unbroken eye contact. That $8 million must officially land in the Cayman Islands account. It must register on Leo's private dashboard as a fully completed, successful transaction. He'd laughed about it. The exact second he attempts to transfer those funds to his secondary cleaning accounts, My silent quarantine protocol will instantly snap shut. You know how she is, Dad? The funds will be legally trapped in a secure federal escrow vault under the Patriot Act. By allowing them to complete the crime, you know how she is, Dad, from simple attempted fraud to the execution of a major act of international financial terrorism. You know how she is, Dad. Victoria and Derek won't be facing a local DA. They will face the relentless wrath of the U.S. Treasury. You know how she is, Dad. They will face decades in a maximum security federal prison with absolutely no possibility of parole. We must let the trap close perfectly. We must let them believe they've won. Harris stared at me, the profound reality of my strategy finally sinking into his brain. He slowly placed the radio on the table. A solemn respect replacing his anger. You are a terrifying adversary, Mr. Stanton, he whispered softly. Before I could answer, the heavy steel door of the interrogation room swung open violently. The two uniformed officers immediately stepped aside. Standing in the doorway, breathing heavily as if he had just sprinted up 3 flights of stairs, was my former attorney, Jonathan Bradley. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, and his right hand gripped a sleek silver iPad. His usually composed, stoic face was pale and slick with a fine sheen of sweat. He looked directly at me, completely ignoring the detective. "Rick," Jonathan said, his voice cracking with a raw urgency. "Rick," Jonathan said, his voice cracking with a raw urgency that immediated to turn on the national news broadcast. "You national news broadcast right now." Victoria didn't just call the anonymous tip line. She just walked out the front door of your estate, and she is broadcasting live on national television. Jonathan placed the sleek silver tablet directly in the center of the scratched metal table, tapping the screen to turn the volume to maximum. The harsh hum of the precinct fluorescent lights seemed to dim in comparison to the bright glow of the live HD news feed. Detective Harris leaned forward. "You know how she is, Dad," completely forgetting his radio, his eyes locked on the digital display. "You know how she is, Dad." Musum Moens. I sat motionless in my metal folding chair, my breathing slow and measured as the morning news anchor appeared on screen. The reporter spoke with a solemn, heavy expression, using the low, urgent cadence reserved for national tragedies and high-profile scandals. He announced, "Now how she is, Dad." He announced that a massive federal investigation was currently unfolding in the affluent international of money laundering syndicate, centering around a shocking cut from the sterile newsroom to a live, chaotic scene playing out wide front lawn of my private estate. Playing out on the wide front lawn of my private estate. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured grass. The red and blue police lights were still flashing frantically. "You know how she is, Dad," painting the brick facade of the house. Standing directly in the center of the driveway, completely surrounded by a swarm of aggressive reporters and jostling camera operators, was my treacherous wife. Victoria was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She wore a simple, unpretentious gray sweater, her arms wrapped tightly across her chest as if she were desperately shivering from the cold. She wore absolutely no makeup, and her usually pristine hair was tied up in a loose, messy bun. Her pale face was streaked with heavy, realistic tear tracks, her eyes wide and trembling with manufactured terror. She looked entirely like a broken, grief-stricken spouse whose world had just been violently shattered. Derek stood slightly behind her, playing the protective, traumatized son, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder. A dozen heavy microphones were thrust aggressively into her face. Victoria took a trembling, choked breath and began to speak, her voice cracking perfectly on cue. She told the hungry media crew that she had accidentally uncovered a hidden encrypted server on her husband's computer late last night. She wept openly, her shoulders shaking as she claimed she had found undeniable, horrifying evidence that her loving husband of 12 years had been secretly running a massive, illegal international laundering syndicate. For some terrifying, she spun a terrifying, highly persuasive tale, painting herself as a brave but utterly terrified whistleblower as well, who had no choice but to call the federal authorities immediately to stop my financial reign of terror. I watched her financial reign of terror. I watched her wipe a tear from her cheek, her voice suddenly gaining a righteous strength. She looked directly into the main news camera, her eyes burning with a fabricated, passionate resolve. She publicly condemned me, labeling me a manipulative, cold-blooded monster who used his esteemed comrade in the federal honors from federal government to steal millions of dollars from innocents, hard-working American citizens. Then she delivered the absolute masterstroke of her treacherous public relations campaign. She announced to the nation that she was immediately filing an emergency federal injunction through her legal counsel. You know how she is, Dad. She made it clear that her primary goal was to actively freeze the $8 million currently resting in the offshore holding account and legally take full control of those funds. She vowed to the breathless reporters that she would not rest until every single penny of the stolen money was recovered and rightfully returned to my alleged victims of fraud. The media swallowed her story whole. The news anchor appeared on screen, gravely confirming that I was now a highly dangerous fugitive wanted by federal authorities, a white-collar predator finally exposed by the extraordinary courage of his own wife. The broadcast transitioned seamlessly to a panel of legal experts. You know how she is, Dad, all of whom immediately began analyzing the severity of my alleged crimes and praising Victoria's incredible civic duty. You know how she is, Dad. Detective Harris stared at the tablet in absolute shock, his mouth slightly open. You know how she is, his investigator's instincts overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the lie playing out on television. You know how she is, Dad. He slowly reached out and pressed the power button, plunging the metal table back into silence. He turned his head to me. You know how she is, Dad, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound disbelief and rising panic. He ran his hands through his thinning white hair and leaned back heavily in his chair. You know how she is, Dad. This is an absolute disaster, Mr. Stanton, Harris muttered, his voice dropping to a gravelly, tense whisper. You know how she is, Dad. She has controlled the public narrative. By tomorrow morning, every federal agency will be hunting you down, and every news network will paint you as a financial terrorist. You know how she is, Dad. She managed to turn herself into a martyr while handing your head to the authorities on a silver platter. He leaned across the table. You know how she is, Dad, his knuckles white from gripping the metal edge. You know how she is, Dad. How do you fight a PR disaster of this scale? She took the moral high ground and destroyed your reputation in less than 3 minutes of airtime. I didn't break my calm, calculating posture. I reached out, picked up the lukewarm, stale cup of precinct coffee next to my phone, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The bitter, you know how she is, Dad, acidic taste washed over my tongue, focusing my mind even further. I placed the styrofoam cup down carefully. Crossed hands neatly on the tabletop, and let a small, truly cold smile spread across my face. I looked directly into the detective's panicked eyes. You are completely missing the absolute beauty of her catastrophic mistake. Detective, I replied smoothly. She didn't just ruin my public reputation by going on national television and officially filing a federal injunction to take control of that specific offshore holding account. She has just asserted in a court of law, in a direct ownership over a highly monitored, heavily sanctioned international criminal asset. She thinks she is building an impenetrable shield of public sympathy to safely extract $8 million. But she bound her own dollars. But she has just voluntarily bound her own name, her own signature, and her own legal representation directly to Leo's illegal cartel network. I leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. You know how she is, Dad. She just signed her own arrest warrant on live television, and it's wrapped in a beautiful, legally binding federal bow, just as the profound weight of my strategy settled in the quiet interrogation room. The suffocating silence was suddenly shattered, connined a sharp, aggressive vibration erupted from Jonathan's charcoal suit pocket. My attorney pulled out his secure mobile device, scanning the bright notification lighting up the black screen. The color bright notification from the black's ease. The color instantly drained from his absolute shock, and his rigid posture hardened into absolute shock. He slowly looked up from his phone, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying, unprecedented intensity. "Rick?" Jonathan whispered, his voice hollow and tight with sudden dread. "The federal court just issued a priority alert. The presiding judge, moved by Victoria's tears and her fabricated plea for justice, has granted her emergency injunction. She is now legally and fully in control of that offshore holding account." Jonathan stood frozen in the doorway of the interrogation room. "You know how she is." His tailored charcoal suit looked entirely out of place against the pale green cinderblock walls. He gripped the silver tablet, his knuckles white. "You know how she is, Dad." The harsh hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder, filling the suffocating silence. He stared at me. "You know how she is, Dad," waiting for the devastating reality of his announcement to completely shatter my composure. Victoria had outmaneuvered us. She had bypassed the local police raid, gone straight to the national media, cried her fabricated tears, and successfully convinced a federal control of the $8 million control currently sitting in the offshore holding account. Detective Harris let out a long, gravelly sigh. Sinking back into his cheap folding chair. He stared at the scratched tabletop, his shoulders slumping under the weight of an absolute, catastrophic failure. "She got the money," Harris whispered, his voice completely drained of its previous righteous anger. "Lapped?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with bitter resignation. "We lost, Mr. Stanton. She played the entire system flawlessly. She used my precinct to launch the raid, used the media to build a shield of public sympathy, and now she used a federal judge to hand jurisdiction to the vault. By the time the Treasury untangles this massive jurisdictional mess, I looked at the detective, and then at my panicked attorney. I didn't sigh. I simply reached out, picked up the lukewarm cup of precinct coffee, and took another slow bite, set the cup back on the sip. With a soft thud, I set the cup back on the table. I shook my head slowly, letting a genuine, relaxed smile spread across my face. Reaching into my leather overnight bag, I pulled out my encrypted laptop and flipped open the screen. You are both looking at this situation through the narrow lens of a standard robbery," I said smoothly. my voice projecting a calm, unyielding authority. You know how she is, Dad. You see a woman who has just legally walked away with a vault full of cash. You know how Cecide. But what I see is a woman who has just voluntarily walked into a maximum security federal prison and handed the keys to the warden herself. You know how she is. Jonathan took a step closer into the room, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. Rick. The judge signed the injunction, he argued, gesturing toward the tablet. The order is fully executed. As of exactly 4 minutes ago, she is the legally recognized owner of that Cayman Islands holding account. I turned the laptop toward them, the screen lighting up the dim room with the bold, white text of highly classified federal statutes. Take a very close look at the specific legal mechanics of what she has just accomplished, I instructed them. Victoria went on national television and publicly declared that she was filing an emergency injunction to seize the funds and return them to the victims. She is, Dad. To do that, she had to submit a sworn, legally binding affidavit to a federal judge. She had to officially register her name, her personal social security number, you know how she is, Dad, and the operational details of her newly formed charity foundation as the primary receiving entity. Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read. He read the complex legal jargon scrolling across my monitor. I still don't see how this helps us, the detective admitted. She secured the money. She secured absolute legal liability for a terrorist asset, I corrected him sharply. You know how she is, Dad. Victoria thinks that account simply holds my $8 million of stolen wealth. What she doesn't know is that Jonathan and I initiated the silent quarantine protocol earlier tonight. You know how she is, Dad. When we locked that account, we didn't just freeze the funds. We explicitly flagged the Cayman Islands routing numbers inside the IRS and Treasury back-end servers. You know how she is, Dad. We permanently categorized that specific offshore holding company as a level 1 federal threat. Link, you know how she had a Leo and his known international money laundering syndicate. I watched the realization slowly dawn on Jonathan's face. His mouth opened slightly as the pure, terrifying brilliance of the trap finally became clear. By filing that federal injunction, I continued, my voice steady and cold, Victoria, how she is, Dad. Victoria has just on the official legal record asserted direct personal ownership over an active, highly monitored cartel account. You know how she is, Dad. She swore under penalty of perjury that she is the rightful custodian of those funds. And even more fatally, the charity foundation she used to secure the injunction is co-signed by my son, Derek. He is listed as the primary financial director on all the forged, tax-exempt forms created on my computer tonight. Harris let out a sharp breath. The cynical despair completely vanished of sheer shock, replaced by an expression of sheer shock. You know how she is, Dad. They didn't just steal your money, the detective whispered, staring at me as if looking at a ghost. No, they didn't, I confirmed, snapping the laptop shut with an incredibly satisfying click. They have just legally tied their own names to a recognized, sanctioned terrorist organization. They walked voluntarily into a federal court, signing legally binding documents claiming ownership over deeply illicit funds. The specific IRS tripwires I established earlier tonight automatically log any unauthorized attempt to access that account as an act of international financial terrorism. By taking control of the funds, Victoria and Derek have just committed federal treason and grand larceny on paper. You know how she is, Dad. They have effectively bypassed the need for a lengthy investigation or a complex trial. They have provided federal prosecutors with a signed, iron-clad confession. The massive weight of their catastrophic mistake hung heavily in the quiet interrogation room. You know how she is, Dad? Victoria thought she was paving the way for a beautiful future in the Bahamas with her dangerous lover. Instead, she had meticulously built an inescapable cage for herself and my treacherous son. The federal government wouldn't even need to hunt them down. The authorities simply had to wait for them to attempt a single withdrawal, and the full weight of the American justice system would crash down upon them with absolute unrelenting finality. Jonathan slowly lowered his tablet, letting out a soft laugh that sounded almost breathless with disbelief. "Shh, Rick," he said, shaking his head in absolute awe. "That is the most brutal, flawless execution of asset forfeiture law I have ever seen. You destroyed them completely without lifting a single finger." The dead silence was suddenly shattered by a loud, rapid vibration. The sharp, buzzing sound rattled against the metal table. We all looked down. Dad. My phone was ringing right next to the coffee cup. "You know how she is, Dad?" I stared at the glowing caller ID, a chill racing down my spine. The name flickering on the screen was Derek. My son, the arrogant fool who had conspired to send me to federal prison, was calling me from the epicenter of his own disaster. He assumed I was currently sitting in a cell, utterly ruined and broken. Detective Harris watched the phone with intense curiosity. I reached out, swiped the glass to answer. Hit speakerphone, and set it on the table. The sharp, mechanical ringing cut off the instant my finger touched the glass. I leaned back in the uncomfortable folding chair, leaving the device sitting in the center of the scratched metal interrogation table. "You know how she is, Dad." For a moment, the only sounds in the suffocating little room were Detective Harris's rhythmic, heavy breathing and the faint, restless shifting of Jonathan's weight near the heavy iron door. Then, a voice broke through the tiny digital speaker, shattering the silence. It was Derek. His voice sounded frantic, his words pouring out in a breathless, chaotic torrent. It was clearly designed by an expert to convey absolute terror and deep filial piety. It was a brilliant, almost flawless performance, an Oscar-worthy portrayal of a traumatized child who had just realized his father was in grave danger. He'd laughed about it. "You know how she is, Dad. If I hadn't spent the entire night watching him manipulate the shadows through my hidden cameras to ruin me, I might have actually believed the panic bleeding through the line. Dad, oh my God. Dad, please tell me you're there. Please tell me you can hear me." Derek shouted through the speaker. "You know how she is, Dad," panting as if he were running a marathon while gripping the steering wheel of his expensive sports car. "I just saw the national news broadcast at the Harbor Club. Everyone in the country is watching this Harbor Club at the Harbor Club. Everyone in the country is watching this absolute nightmare live on morning TV. I saw Victoria and federal agents standing in the driveway. I saw the flashing lights, the conmen lighting the Tiber lights illuminating the front lawn of the estate. I completely panicked when I realized you'd been... You know how she is, Dad. I've been calling your private number for 20 minutes, trying to figure out where the authorities took you. Listen to me closely, Dad. You have absolutely nothing to worry about. I've handled everything on this end. I've already contacted the toughest top-tier defense attorney team in all of Virginia. You know how she is, Dad. They're assembling a crisis management group to fight these absurd, fabricated charges. You know how speeding on the interstate. I'm currently speeding on the interstate, driving this car as fast as the engine can handle. I'm driving straight to the main precinct to bail you out personally. I will not let you sit in a dirty concrete holding cell for crimes you clearly didn't commit. We're going to get through this together as a family. Just hold on a few more minutes." His shameless lies hung heavies in the stale air of the interrogation room. Detective Harris stared at the black plastic box on the metal table. "You know how she is, Dad." His jaw clamped so tight, the muscles in his cheeks were twitching. He was watching a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation in real time. Jonathan stood motionless by the door, eyes wide, digesting the absolute depravity of my own flesh and blood. I took a slow, deep breath, preparing for my own calculated performance. I needed to feed his massive ego, make him believe his trap was running perfectly, and lure him blindly into the center of the web I'd spun myself. Derek. Derek, thank God you called me. I forced my voice to tremble and crack, projecting the fragile, "You know how she is, Dad," pathetic vulnerability of a broken, utterly defeated old man. I adjusted my tone perfectly, sounding deeply confused, terrified, and crushed by the night's catastrophic events. I even slumped my shoulders physically. "You know how she is," embodying the desperation I projected through the line. "I don't understand what happened to me tonight, Derek. Local officers brought me to this dark precinct hours ago. You know how she is, Dad. Federal agents are tearing my private study apart right now. They're aggressively interrogating me, demanding I confess to massive international bank transfers and illegal offshore accounts. They're telling me I stole millions. They say I'm going to spend the rest of my life in a maximum security federal prison. I didn't do any of this. Son, you have to believe me. Someone has framed me in the most vicious way. I don't know how to fight this kind of massive government machine. I'm so terrified." Through the speaker, I heard Derek exhale slowly. It was the sound of a predator sensing his cornered prey exposing a fatal weakness. He had swallowed the bait completely. "You know how she is, Dad." He truly believed I was sitting in this room, weeping and shaking, paralyzed by the sheer terror of an impending federal indictment. The frantic, high-pitched panic vanished from his voice instantly, replaced by a low, urgent, and deeply conspiratorial whisper. He was closing in for the kill. "Listen to me now, Dad. You know how she is, Dad. You need to remain absolutely silent. Do not speak to any detectives. Do not answer a single question the federal agents ask you. They are actively building a massive case against you, and they will twist every single word you say to guarantee a conviction. The most important thing for us right now, this very second, is to protect your personal estate. We cannot let the federal government swoop in and seize all your savings while you're behind bars fighting these horrific, fabricated charges. I need you to listen very carefully, Dad. My defense attorney has already drafted power of attorney. I am bringing it to the precinct right now. I am bringing it straight to the precinct right now. The second I walk through that front door, I need you to sign over full legal control of all your domestic assets to me immediately. If you sign the power of attorney into a secure, untraceable corporate trust before the Treasury can complete a full asset freeze on you, I will guard every penny of your wealth. I'll how she is, Dad. I'll hide it so deep federal auditors will never touch it. But we must move with absolute blinding speed. The government moves fast, and the window of opportunity to protect your estate is closing rapidly. Just keep your mouth shut. Wait for me to arrive, and the moment I put the documents on the table, sign them immediately. Don't worry about anything else tonight. I'm coming to save you. I'm grateful, son, I whispered into the receiver. letting my voice quiver one last time. Please hurry. The digital connection clicked sharply, disconnecting completely. You know how she is, Dad? I leaned forward in the quiet interrogation room, letting the deep, heavy silence wash over the sterile space once more. I reached out slowly, took the device, you know how she is, Dad, and slid it into the inner pocket of my custom suit jacket. I looked up, meeting Detective Harris's shocked gaze. My fragile, terrified facade vanished without a trace, replaced by cold, unshakable resolve. Get your heavy cuffs ready, Detective, I commanded softly. The absolute savior will be here in 5 minutes. Detective Harris didn't say a word, newfound awe. He simply nodded, his eyes locked with a deep, newfound awe. You know how she is, Dad? He slowly rose from the scratched metal table, adjusting his heavy scratchel efficiency, a gesture that completely erased his professional fishtingshi, a gesture that completely erased his previous frustration. We walked out of the suffocating interrogation room together, leaving the stale air and harsh fluorescent lights behind. I draped my tailored navy suit, Dad. I draped my tailored navy suit jacket casually over my right shoulder and rolled up the sleeves of my crisp white dress shirt. I felt an incredible, light sense of freedom taking root deep in my bones. For the past 3 hours, I'd been playing a terrified, cornered animal. Now the absolute predator was emerging from the shadows. He'd laughed about it. You know how she is. We walked silently down the narrow, scuffed hallway toward the main precinct lobby. The heavy double doors separating the holding cells from the public reception area gave off a low electronic hum. Harris swiped his badge, and we stepped into the vast, brightly lit lobby. For a Friday morning, the lobby was relatively quiet, with only a few weary officers processing overnight paperwork and a lone janitor pushing a mop bucket across the dull linoleum. I leaned comfortably against the cold concrete wall near the security door, arms crossed, waiting for the grand theatrical performance I knew arms crossed. Ain was about to unfold. Exactly. 4 minutes later, the heavy glass doors at the main precinct entrance were shoved open violently. Derek strode into the precinct with an intense, misplaced arrogance. You know how she is, Dad. It was the arrogance of a man who thought he practically owned the world. You know how she is, Dad. He was wearing a perfectly tailored midnight blue Italian suit, a suit that likely cost more than most officers in the room made in a month. His hair was perfectly styled, slicked back, projecting absolute corporate authority. He looked nothing like a terrified, grief-stricken son, desperately like a terrified from a catastrophic misunderstanding. He looked entirely like corporate misunderstanding. He looked entirely like a corporate raider arriving to finalize a hostile takeover and claim total victory. Flanking him on both sides were 2 extremely imposing defense attorneys dressed in speed attire. Dressed in somber, strict attire. They carried thick, heavy leather briefcases, their faces masks of bored, aggressive superiority. Derek marched straight toward the Miri duty sergeant, who was raising a hand to signal him Sergeant Nob, to showed to signal him to stop. Derek slammed his open palm onto the tall wooden counter, demanding immediate, unquestionable attention. He raised his voice to fill the entire hall. You know how she is, Dad, ensuring everyone in the room could hear the grand performance of his manufactured rage. He declared himself the son of Richard Stanton, the man they had wrongly and illegally arrested earlier this morning. He demanded to see the commander immediately, threatening a career-ending lawsuit if his father wasn't released into his custody right away. He gestured toward the 2 expensive lawyers standing stiffly at his loudly, claiming they held an emergency federal injunction and a comprehensive power of attorney. You know how documents that clearly superseded any local jurisdictional authority. I stood in the shadows near the security door, watching my son perform his act to perfection. He played the part of the angry, protective heir flawlessly. You know how she is, Dad. He was laying the foundation to seize total control of my entire estate. You know how she is, Dad, using his expensive legal team to bulldoze through the local police department's bureaucracy before the federal government could properly secure my assets. It was an incredibly brilliant and aggressively bold strategy. If he were actually dealing with an aging, terrified old man, this would have worked perfectly. I pushed away from the cold concrete wall and stepped slowly, deliberately out into the harsh overhead light of the main hall. You know how she is, Dad. The crisp, rhythmic click of my leather shoes on the linoleum rang out loudly, instantly drawing the attention of the two defense attorneys. They turned simultaneously. You know how she is, Dad, their aggressive posturing wavering in a fraction of a second. Derek noticed the sudden shift in their focus and turned slowly. The instant his face, lit with an arrogant, smug grin, locked onto mine, the smile completely evaporated. He froze perfectly, his mouth hanging slightly open as his brain struggled violently to process the impossible sight of the man standing directly in front of him. I wasn't wearing an orange jumpsuit. I wasn't locked in a dark, miserable cell. I wasn't shaking with fear, nor was I begging for his miraculous rescue. I stood freely in the center of the precinct, suit jacket, draped bar of the precinct, casually draped over my shoulder, looking entirely relaxed and in total control of the entire building. Dad? Derek stammered, his voice shrinking to a high-pitched, powerless tone that betrayed his absolute internal panic. The confident corporate raider vanished instantly, replaced by a terrified little boy caught in the middle of a massive lie. Why are you here? Why aren't you in a cell? They told me you were being processed for massive federal fraud. The two expensive defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. You know how she is, Dad. They realized very quickly that the situation was spiraling completely out of control. I didn't break my steady, unyielding stare at my son. I walked slowly across the precinct hall, the sound of my footsteps echoing loudly in the deafening silence. I walked straight past the two high-paid lawyers. You know how she is, Dad, completely ignoring their existence, and stopped just inches from Derek. I could see tiny beads, Dad. I could see tiny beads of cold sweat seeping from the hairline of his perfect hairstyle. I could see the frantic, desperate calculations burning in his eyes as his entire reality began to collapse. I leaned in extremely close, closing the distance until I was speaking directly into his right ear. I dropped my voice to a dangerous, icy whisper, ensuring he alone heard the absolute finality of his total defeat. Did you really think, Derek, you know how she is, that a senior Treasury auditor wouldn't notice a physical USB drive on his own desk, shifting by exactly 2 millimeters? Sarble. Seeing the pure terror wash violently across his pale face was the most satisfying reward I had received in my long life. You know how she is, Dad. Before Derek could even attempt to organize a single coherent response, before his highly paid legal team could demand an explanation or mount any defense. You know how she is, Dad. The heavy double glass doors of the main precinct entrance were shoved open for the second time. The thunderous sound of heavy tactical boots hitting the hard linoleum floor completely drowned out the quiet hall. 6 heavily armed federal agents, all wearing deep blue, windbreakers with the striking yellow letters representing the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, printed on their backs. Know how she is? Poured into the room with absolute military precision. They moved with blinding speed. You know how she is, Dad. Immediately securing the perimeter and completely bypassing the stunned local duty sergeant. The lead federal agent, a tall man with an incredibly imposing presence and a stern, uncompromising expression, marched straight into the center of the hall. He completely ignored me. He completely ignored the two terrified defense attorneys. Dad. He raised his right hand and pointed a thick, accusing finger directly at the chest of my trembling, panic-stricken son, effectively declaring the absolute end of his miserable existence. The lead agent didn't hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He lunged forward with terrifying speed, grabbing the lapels of Derek's expensive Italian suit with his massive, calloused fists. Before Derek's brain could even process the violent shift in reality, the agent spun him around with brutal, practiced efficiency and slammed his face hard against the hard wooden surface of the main reception desk. The sickening, dull thud of the impact echoed through the hall, leaving everyone in the room dead silent. The weary duty sergeant immediately stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of total submission to federal jurisdiction. Derek let out a short, "You know how she is, Dad," breathless cry of pain as the agent forced his arms behind his back. The sharp, "You know how she is, Dad," metallic clatter of heavy handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists sounded like the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. "Derek Stanton," the lead agent roared, his deep voice filled with absolute, terrifying authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and internal corporate money laundering. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use that right, and I strongly suggest you maze that right now, and stop digging your grave any deeper. You know how she is, Dad." The pure panic that erupted from my son was entirely pathetic. He began to struggle weakly against the sturdy counter. "You know how she is," his expensive shoes sliding futilely across the slick linoleum. He twisted his neck, his eyes wide and leaking fresh, terrified tears. He looked frantically toward the two imposing defense attorneys he had just strutted into the precinct with. "Do something!" Derek screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical register. "I pay you $500 an hour. Show them the power of attorney. Tell them to let me go. This is a massive mistake. You have to stop them right now. I'm not supposed to be in handcuffs." The two attorneys didn't move a single muscle to help him. "You know how she is, Dad." The older, graying and shrewd lawyer among them stepped forward cautiously, making a soothing gesture toward the federal tactical team. He politely requested to see the official warrant before they processed his client. A deputy FBI agent pulled a thick, "You know how she is, Dad," heavily stamped document from his tactical vest and slapped it forcefully against the lawyer's chest. I watched the lawyer's eyes scan the complex legal text. I watched the exact moment his professional confidence completely evaporated. He'd laughed about it. The federal arrest warrant explicitly detailed charges of international terrorist financing and cited a direct, "You know how she is, Dad," undeniable link to a sanctioned cartel holding account in the Cayman Islands. The lawyer turned pale, all the color draining from his face. He looked at the federal agent, then down at the boy screaming and struggling on the desk. He slowly folded the arrest warrant, handed it back to the agent, and took 3 extremely deliberate steps backward, physically distancing himself from my son. "We don't handle federal terrorism charges," the lawyer stated coldly, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. "We are officially withdrawing as legal counsel for Mr. Stanton. Effective immediately. You are entirely on your own, Derek. We cannot help you fight the U.S. Treasury." As the high-paid legal umbrella he had hired vanished into thin air, Derek let out a guttural sob of desperation. He whipped his head around, his terrified eyes locking onto mine. He looked at me with the desperate, pleading gaze of a lost child, completely forgetting that just 10 minutes ago he was actively plotting to lock me in a federal prison and steal my life savings. "Dad!" Derek cried, tears streaming freely down his bruised cheeks. "Dad, you have to help me. You know how she is, Dad. You know I didn't do these things. You know I'm innocent. Please, tell them to stop. Tell them I'm your son. You can't let them do this to me." I didn't flinch. I stood motionless. I just stood there, suit jacket, casually draped over my shoulder, looking down at him with an expression as cold and merciless as solid ice. I felt not a flicker of pity, nor any fatherly instinct to protect him from the fire he had intentionally ignited. He had made his choices in the shadows, and now he would burn in the blinding light of federal justice. I walked slowly to the desk, standing directly beside the federal agent who was holding my son down. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and produced my phone. I tapped the screen to unlock it, opening the highly classified federal tracking application that had been syncing with tracking servers. I had been syncing with the Treasury servers. I held the glowing screen directly in front of Derek's tear-streaked face, forcing him to look at the undeniable digital evidence of his own stupidity. "Look at the screen very closely, Derek," I said softly, my voice cutting through his hysterical sobbing like a scalpel. "Do you recognize that specific routing number? It belongs to the Cayman Islands secure secure account. Do you had successfully wired 8 million tired? You thought you were incredibly dollars tonight. You thought you were incredibly clever. You thought how she is. You thought you and your treacherous wife were playing a brilliant game of international financial chess. But what you are looking at is the real-time tracking feed from the Internal Revenue Service. That account is a honeypot. That is a digital trap designed to catch much larger prey, and you walked straight into the center of the cage like a blind mouse." I scrolled down slowly through the digital files. "She is, Dad." I scrolled down slowly through the digital files displayed on my phone, highlighting a striking passage for him to read. When Victoria filed that emergency federal injunction on national television, she legally asserted ownership over those illicit funds, I explained, my words landing like heavy stones on his shattered reality. But she needed a legitimate domestic financial entity to process the paperwork. She forged digital signatures onto the founding documents. Do you understand what that means, Derek? The federal government has just officially seized the entire offshore account. And this real-time confiscation document currently lists Victoria Stanton and Derek Stanton as the legally binding terrorist asset, as the legally binding primary administrators of a sanctioned terrorist asset. You didn't steal my money, you merely signed a legally binding confession to grand larceny and international racketeering. Your beautiful wife, you know how she is, Dad? Your beautiful wife just destroyed your entire life to save herself, and she used your own extreme greed to do it. The crushing reality that he had absolutely no escape finally swallowed him whole. The strength for his frantic struggling left his body entirely. Derek collapsed onto the desk like a rag doll. "You know how she is, Dad." The federal agent braced against his dead weight, pulled him upright, and pushed him roughly toward the secure holding area. Derek fell heavily to his knees in the center of the precinct floor, his suit crinkling from the collapse. He buried his face in his handcuffed hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "You know how she is, Dad." He had absolutely nothing left. I looked down at the pathetic shell of the boy I had once loved. I turned my back. "Tyne. Keep him completely isolated, Detective. Now, let's go pay a visit to my grieving wife." The drive back from the precinct to McLean was filled with quiet anticipation. Detective Harris drove the unmarked police car beside me, his hands gripping the steering wheel thus tightly as the morning sun climbed into the sky. You know how she is, Dad." I sat in the passenger seat, looking relaxed as the familiar streets rolled past. The chaotic kirkiks that had occupied my front lawn hours ago had dispersed. You know how she is, leaving behind only the trampled grass and the hollow echo of my wife's tearful performance. He'd laughed about it. She had spun a web of lies and manipulated a federal judge into handing her control of my supposed fortune. She thought the war was won. She thought it was all over. Inside my private estate, Victoria was celebrating the peak of her treacherous campaign. Through the surveillance feed I was still monitoring on my mobile device, I visualized the scene perfectly unfolding in the formal living room. "You know how she is, Dad." She sat elegantly on the expensive Italian leather sofa, her fabricated tears replaced entirely by a radiant glow of triumph. "You know how she is, Dad." Her close friend, Monica, leaned lazily against the matching armchair. They were tapping crystal champagne glasses filled with vintaged, bubbly, toasting to their perfect victory. The morning news was playing quietly on the television, with legal authorities endlessly praising Victoria's civic courage. "You know how she is, Dad." Resting on the glass coffee table between them, illuminated by the sunlight streaming through the windows, was the newly signed federal injunction. It was her golden ticket to absolute freedom, her legal shield against financial investigation, and the precise instrument of her impending doom. They laughed. "You know how she is, Dad," the sharp sounds echoing through the mansion's empty hallways. Victoria took an elegant sip of champagne, her eyes reflecting the pure champagne, the pure greed that had driven her to destroy our marriage. She believed those $8 million were permanently hers. She believed Derek was executing the final phase of Marcel's wealth, the fuss of their hostile takeover, forcing me to sign away my domestic wealth. She is, Dad." She was completely unaware that her son was sitting on the cold floor of a federal holding cell, crying into his handcuffed hands, suffering a mental breakdown. "You know how she is," and facing decades of imprisonment. She was completely oblivious to the armored tactical vehicles parked quietly at the edge of our wide driveway. The federal tactical team moved with terrifying efficiency. No siren announced their arrival. A dozen heavily armed agents, wearing heavy gear and carrying entry equipment, poured out of the black vehicles. "You know how she is, Dad." They moved swiftly across the manicured lawn, gathering outside the estate's custom mahogany front door. Detective Harris parked our unmarked car quietly near the front door, leaving the engine at a steady idle. He'd laughed about it. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out into the crisp morning air, standing comfortably at the edge of the driveway, ready to witness the spectacular end of Victoria's grand illusion. In the living room, Monica raised her crystal glass for another toast. She didn't get the chance to finish. The front door was slammed off its heavy iron hinges with a deafening explosion that shook the house's foundation. The massive panels buckled inward with a terrifying crack, raining splinters of wood and shards of glass across the grand foyer. Victoria let out a scream of genuine pure terror. You know how she is, Dad. Her champagne glass dropping to the hardwood floor and shattering into shimmering shards. Dad? Tactical boots thundered against the polished floor as federal agents poured into the living room from every conceivable angle. They raised their weapons, their voices erupting with uncompromising authority. Federal agents, put your hands where we can see them now. The shouted commands echoed through the house. You know how she is, Dad, completely drowning out the television broadcast. Monica immediately dropped to her knees, raising her shaking hands high above her head, her face turning ashen. But Victoria, blinded by her incredible legal arrogance and absolute belief in her duly acquired legal immunity, she surged to her feet from the leather sofa, her face twisted into a mask of angry protest. She snatched the freshly signed court documents from the glass coffee table, waving them aggressively at the advancing tactical team. You can't come into my house, Victoria shrieked, her voice sharp and controlling. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here. I'm the victim. I'm the one who called the police. You've made a massive mistake. I have a legally binding court order protecting my assets, do you hear me? I have a federal injunction signed by a judge just hours ago. You can't touch me. You can't touch anything in this house. The lead FBI agent, a tall woman with eyes as cold as forged steel, stepped forward calmly. She didn't raise her weapon. She simply reached a gloved hand and smoothly plucked the crumpled legal documents from Victoria's frantic grasp. The agent glanced down at the documents, her eyes scanning the official judicial seal and Victoria's bold signature at the bottom of the page. A chilling smile spread across the federal agent's face. "Thank you, ma'am," the agent replied, her voice filled with a calm satisfaction that effectively muted Victoria's hysterical screaming. You know how she is, Dad. We thought it might take us months to try to prove you had direct knowledge of these illicit funds. But this signed document, you know how she is, Dad, claiming legal ownership of an offshore account linked to a sanctioned cartel, is exactly the written confession we needed. Victoria froze. The color vanished from her face, turning her skin a translucent, sickly pale. Her mouth opened and closed silently, her brain struggling to process the devastating reality of the trap she had just voluntarily walked into. She hadn't seized my money. Stop! She had officially claimed on permanent federal record that she was the owner of dirty cartel funds. Heavy steel handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists with a sharp metallic click, biting into her delicate skin. The agent turned her around, roughly ignoring her desperate weeping, and began to escort her out of the grand living room she had declared her kingdom. You know how she is, Dad. They forcibly dragged wreckage of the shattered front door and into the bright morning sun. Dad. Victoria stumbled down the wide stone steps, her legs shaking weakly, her head bowed in total humiliation. She was crying hysterically now, begging the stone-faced agents to listen to her explanations, pleading with them to let her call her lawyer. They ignored her frantic sobbing entirely. You know how she is, Dad. The lead agent shoved her roughly toward the back seat of a waiting cruiser, pulling the heavy door open and forcing her inside. Just before the agent pushed her head down to avoid the door frame, Victoria turned tear-stained face toward the driveway. She was searching for an escape route, for any sliver of hope. Instead, she saw me. She said, I stood quietly in the center of the driveway, the exact spot where she had performed her act for the national media 12 der Ax Aftol media 12 hours ago. I held my up against my chest, the camera pointed directly at her disfigured face. As our eyes locked across the distance, I watched the devastating reality wash over her entirely. I didn't speak. I just stood there, recording every second of her destruction with a cold smile, promising her an absolute, inescapable ruin. The drive back to the main precinct was filled with quiet anticipation. Detective Harris and I stood by side with Detective Harris. I stood side by side in the dark federal investigator, the main holding area that connected main area. You know how he cinderblock walls. The architects of the conspiracy to destroy me were currently being held in 3 separate interrogation rooms. The breakdown of their alliance was swift, spectacular, and utterly complete. Stripped of their touts, stripped of their high-priced legal counsel, and left to face the crushing weight of federal treason charges, they had no one to turn to but each other. Animalistic ferocity, and they turned on one another with one animalistic ferocity. I stood motionless behind the massive 2-way mirror, my arms loosely crossed, watching the unraveling. Federal prosecutors didn't need aggressive interrogation tactics. They simply walked into each room, slapped the signed injunction on the metal tables, and outlined the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for international terrorist financing, the unified front they'd so arrogantly projected hours earlier, evaporated like morning mist. On the monitor for interrogation room A, Derek sat in a folding chair, his expensive custom suit hanging awkwardly off his frame. He didn't even last 4 minutes. The second the federal agent mentioned 20 years. In a federal prison, my son shattered. He shattered. He began to weep hysterically, selling Victoria out with every breath. He painted her as the mastermind, her as the Muntu, the manipulator who coerced him into the scheme, claiming he was nothing more than a naive pawn in her treacherous game. I felt a wave of any remaining shred of fatherly affection for him vanishing entirely. Centeredless and charisma of vanishing entirely with. Just to save his own skin, just to Siebel with to Cedra's dad. To Stee, he was how she is, Dad. In room B, Monica was putting on an equally pathetic performance. The woman who had lounged on my Italian leather sofa, drinking vintage champagne, was now a trembling, sobbing wreck. Threw herself onto the table. She all but threw herself onto the table, screaming that she had nothing to do with the cartel money, and calling Derek a weak, pathetic fool who had ruined everything. She reserved her deepest vitriol for Victoria, accusing her best of dragging her into a massive federal conspiracy and offering to detail every private conversation in exchange for complete immunity. The House of Cards had fallen, and the desperate rats were tearing each other apart in the cold, empty dark. I shifted my focus to the person directly behind the glass. You know how she is, Dad. Victoria sat alone in room C. She looked exhausted, her posture slumped, the mask of bravery stripped away by the terrifying reality of her situation. The lead agent gave me a slow, knowing nod and pushed open the heavy iron door. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed as I walked in. Victoria lifted her head, her red-rimmed eyes locking onto mine. You know how she is, Dad. For one brief, fleeting moment, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear flash across her pale face. But the instinct to manipulate ran too deep. She closed her eyes. You know how she is, Dad, began to sob softly, and reached out across the scratched metal table, her trembling hands seeking mine. Richard, please, she sobbed. You know how she is, Dad, her voice cracking with practiced vulnerability. You have to help me. Tell them it's all a horrible misunderstanding. We've had 12 men. We've had 12 years. We love each other. I was just scared, confused, and I made a terrible mistake. Please, look into your heart and forgive me. I know you still love me. Don't let them lock me away in a dark cell for the rest of my life. She was delivering the performance of a lifetime, projecting the image of a lost, deeply repentant spouse seeking the comfort of her husband's protection. I didn't move a muscle. She is, Dad. I stood straight, my expression as cold and merciless as a winter storm. I reached into my inner breast pocket and pulled out a stack of small, you know how she is, Dad, high-definition surveillance photos. I tossed them onto the table. They fanned out under the harsh light. They fanned out under the clear, undeniable images of Victoria and Leo embracing in the dark corner of that high-end restaurant, kissing passionately while plotting my ruin. Victoria stared at the photos, the blood draining completely from her tear-streaked face. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her hands fell limp at her sides. You thought you were playing a senile old auditor, I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and lethal. My voice smooth, quiet, and lethal. But you forgot one thing, Victoria. I spent 30 years hunting the smartest financial predators on the planet. You are nothing more than a sloppy amateur. The realization shattered her grand illusion. You know how she is, Dad. She collapsed back into the folding chair, shoulders shaking with hollow sobs as the finality of her situation took hold. She realized she had absolutely nothing left. No money. You know how she is, Dad. No powerful lover, no loyal friends, and no future outside the walls of a federal prison. I turned my back on her and walked out. You know how she is, Dad, leaving the heavy steel door swinging open behind me. I exited the precinct and stepped out into the bright, warm light of the morning sun. 6 months have passed since that morning on the precinct steps. Atan. I attended the high-profile sentencing hearing dressed in my best custom suit, sitting quietly in the back row as their treacherous ambition met its inevitable grand finale. Victoria and Leo stood side by side before the judge. You know how she is, Dad. The charming, untouchable facade she had maintained during our marriage was gone, replaced by the reality of a broken woman facing the abyss. The judge showed no mercy. Dad. For wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, they were each 20 years in a maximum security federal prison, with no possibility of parole. They were led away in heavy chains. You know how she is, Dad. Derek's trial was equally pathetic and immensely satisfying. My son was stripped of his corporate armor and grand illusions. You know how she is. He wept openly in court and begged for leniency as the judge handed down a 12-year sentence. He would spend the prime of his life locked behind bars, surrounded by the criminals he had once foolishly thought he could outsmart. As for Monica, you know how she is, Dad. As for Monica, her desperate Brett's attempt to cue your immunity by accusing her friend Zepar entirely. She avoided prison, but aggressive financial penalties and legal fees drained her domestic accounts completely. She filed for bankruptcy last week, watching helplessly as the federal government seized every asset she owned at auction. They bet their lives on my destruction, and they lost everything. Today, I am far away from the toxic, suffocating wealth of the Virginia suburbs. I am sitting quietly on the wide wooden porch of a secluded cabin deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He'd mentioned the crisp, clean autumn air carries the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. I take a slow, satisfying draw from a premium imported cigar, letting the fragrant smoke lift lazily into the bright afternoon sky. In my other hand is a crystal glass filled with aged, top-shelf bourbon. It burns smooth and warm, a comforting reminder of this hard-won, decisive victory. On the rustic table in front of me are the final notarized legal documents delivered by my attorney, Jonathan, this morning. I lean forward, uncap my favorite fountain pen, and with a steady, unyielding hand, I sign my name on the dotted line. With shoes, Dad, with those few dark strokes of ink, I permanently transfer the recovered $8 million into an irrevocable trust dedicated to vulnerable children in foster care. This account is managed by a strictly independent firm, ensuring touched by familial greed will ever be touched by familial greed or manipulation. The wealth that was meant to destroy my life will now build safe, hopeful futures for children who truly deserve a fighting chance in this world. I lean back in my sturdy wooden chair, looking out over the endless stretch of rugged mountains and the shifting colors of the autumn leaves. I am entirely alone at this altitude, but I am not lonely. It is a profound, Dad. It is a profound, powerful, and completely unburdened solitude. I have finally found absolute peace. Blood does not make a family. Loyalty, respect, and integrity do. For too long, I allowed the titles of father and husband to blind me to the predators sleeping under my own roof. I thought financial support was love, but it only bred entitlement and malice. The hardest lesson a man can learn is this: sometimes the person smiling at you across the table the person smiling at dinner table is the one digging your grave. Never apologize for setting boundaries, and never underestimate your own worth. When they cross the line, let them fall.